We call this the Ramapo Saltbox Environmental Research Center. So it's the Ramapo Saltbox ERC, Environmental Research Center. And the idea behind this is not just the restoration of a 200-year-old ironworker's house that was in Ramapo, which we did manage to save and reassemble, but the idea was to set up an outdoor classroom, a field classroom here in Torrent Valley, and use it for environmental research, for learning what's going on with the environment here, and for using it as a center of activities that we can then hope will be the outgrowth of this building. Michael Edelstein, Professor Michael Edelstein at Ramapo College, writes in his book, Contaminated Communities, that communities advocating for environmental change and social justice, environmental justice, create what he calls liberating structures. It's a sort of a metaphorical idea of pulling together people and place and creating a structural concept around the idea of empowering the community. For me, this is the manifestation of a liberating structure because the building itself becomes the anchor around which so much work can be done here in the Torrent Valley. So it's our classroom, it's our meeting area, it's our there's a certain amount of social integrity to this because people wind up working here and then they wind up sharing their stories. And maybe that's the bottom line here. It's a place of story. All places, of course, are a place of story, but this structure has it has a certain focus in the story. The building was put up to house iron workers over 200 years ago here in the Ramapo Valley. And therefore, the initial story was about industrial concern, people making a living, people scratching out an existence, extracting a resource and shaping it, reshaping it, making it into a marketable item, and those people creating an economy. And it had a toll. 200 years of that sort of work happening here in the Ramapo Valley eventually led to deforestation, it led to massive erosion, loss of species, habitat was fairly well drained and eroded and flooded out. So those people had to move on. Not all of them did. Just like the Ramapo Indians, not all of them moved on. The iron workers, the Indians, these folks stayed here because they were people of the land and they found another way to coexist. And in time, the forest replenishes. And in time, the canopy comes back and there's a good nutrient base that starts to happen into the sediment so that the rivers come back and the fish return and we have good trout and so forth. But in time we also have a national economy that produces other industrial concerns, and eventually into Ramapo came Ford Motor Company. And through the 60s, through the late 50s, the 60s, and then the 70s, Ford dumped a lot of paint up here, a lot of lead paint. And our concern originally here in Torrent Valley and along the Ramapo River corridor was to try to find the paint and remediate the sites. And that involves a lot of investigation, a lot of examination, a lot of study of impact on habitat and water systems, and eventually it includes a lot of negotiation with Ford Motor Company. And so while that was going on, my students and I, back around 2007, were working in the field right here on this site. And we also had saved this building 10 years earlier, in 1997. And we thought, let's put the two together. Let's reassemble the historic building on a site very much close to where it originally was. And let's use it as a center, as a home, for the kind of work we wanted to do with the town of Ramapo and toward the idea of getting the watershed cleaned up. And this is what has happened. This building has grown from here. Because it's a building used for contemporary uses, we have to make it it has to be CO'd properly. It has to be made to be engineered in a fashion that will allow us to have a number of people in here. So it took a while to figure all of that out. Mostly the old timbers that have been brought back in the building are for decorative purposes. Some are structural, but mostly for decorative. And we're still doing this. My students are still making things. We're making boxes and organizers and bookshelves and such out of this 200-year-old wood. So the spirit of the place, we could call it the fiber or the timber or the grain of the place from those days have come forward. And I think it's kind of fitting that This structure, an icon of early industrial impact in the area, is now housing the work that we're doing to remediate later industrial impact in the area.